The Manhattan penthouse of Richard Morrison, billionaire real estate mogul, echoed with the elegant silence of an evening that would change everything. As he sat at his mahogany desk with a gold pen in hand, ready to sign the contract that would transfer half his empire to his wife Victoria, the door burst open. Carmen Rodriguez, the 52-year-old Latina housekeeper who had worked for them for 10 years, rushed into the room with her uniform stained and face twisted with terror. Her words echoed like thunder. "Mr. Richard, don't sign that. Mrs. Victoria, I heard everything on the phone. She's not who you think she is." Victoria Morrison, stunning at 40 in her $3,000 red dress, paled seeing the maid who should never have been there. In that moment, the poor housekeeper everyone ignored pulled out her trembling phone and played a recording that would destroy everything. Victoria's voice talking to her real husband, confessing how she had married Richard only to rob him. The most elaborate scam in America was about to be exposed by the person no one would ever suspect. The Morrison penthouse dominated Manhattan's Upper East Side like a jewel set against the glittering skyline. 45 years old, with an estimated fortune of $800 million, Richard Morrison was one of the most powerful real estate developers in America. He had built his empire starting from a small construction company inherited from his father, transforming it into a money-making machine that dominated the New York market. That November evening, while rain pattered against the panoramic windows of his study, Richard prepared to make the most generous act of his life. On the antique mahogany desk lay a contract that would transfer half his properties to his wife Victoria. $400 million in value, a sum that would make Victoria one of the richest women in America. Victoria Morrison was everything a man could desire. 40 years carried with the elegance of someone born for the spotlight. MBA from Harvard Business School. A past as a model she had abandoned to dedicate herself to charity work. He had met her 3 years earlier at a contemporary art exhibition, and Richard had been struck by her intellectual beauty as much as her physical appearance. The wedding had been like a fairy tale. Ceremony in the Hamptons with 300 guests, honeymoon in the Maldives, impeccable social life between charity galas and exclusive gallery openings. Victoria had managed to conquer not only Richard, but also the New York elite that mattered. She had become president of 2 charitable foundations, organized events to raise funds for sick children. Richard looked at the gold pen he had inherited from his grandfather, the same one with which he had signed his first $1 million contracts. Victoria had made him see that after 3 years of happy marriage, it was right that she too should have an active role in the empire they were building together. She had ambitious plans for the future, wanted to expand charitable activities, create an international foundation. Carmen Rodriguez, the Latina housekeeper, was tidying the house for the night. 52 years old, gray hair pulled back in a severe chignon, blue uniform always impeccable despite the heavy work. She had worked for the Morrison family for 10 years, since when Richard was still a bachelor and lived in a more modest apartment. Carmen had seen everything. Richard's rise from rich entrepreneur to billionaire. Victoria's arrival that had transformed the house into a social salon. The subtle changes that no one else seemed to notice. Because Carmen had a particular gift, she was invisible. Rich people behaved in front of domestic staff as if they were furniture, talking about secrets and confidences without realizing someone was listening. And Carmen had heard many things in recent months. Whispered phone calls Victoria made when she thought she was alone, conversations abruptly interrupted when she entered the room, knowing glances with people Richard didn't know during receptions. That evening, while cleaning upstairs, Carmen had heard Victoria talking on the phone in the bedroom. The tone was different from usual, more intimate, more complicit. She had approached the slightly open door, and what she heard had chilled her blood. Victoria was talking to someone she called "my love," telling how that evening she would finally manage to get her hands on half of Richard's fortune. She spoke of a plan orchestrated for 3 years, of how she had studied every move to gain the billionaire's trust. And above all, she spoke of how she couldn't wait to free herself from that farce and return to her real husband. Carmen had heard enough. She didn't know what to do, how to react. She was just a housekeeper. Who would believe her word against that of Victoria Morrison? But she couldn't let Richard be robbed before her eyes. That man had given her work for 10 years, had always treated her with respect, had increased her salary every year without her asking. As she went down the stairs with her heart beating wildly, Carmen heard Richard's voice from the study. He was about to sign. There was no more time for doubts or hesitations. She rushed toward the study, threw open the door, and screamed the words that would change everything. The silence that followed Carmen's intrusion was deafening. Richard still held the pen suspended over the contract, his gaze oscillating incredulously between the housekeeper and his wife. Victoria had instantly lost her radiant smile, replaced by an expression of poorly concealed panic. Carmen trembled visibly, aware of having crossed every hierarchical limit, but she had made the most courageous decision of her life, and now had to go all the way. With trembling hands, she extracted an old smartphone from her uniform pocket and placed it on the mahogany table. Richard looked at the phone as if it were an alien object. Victoria jumped up from her chair, trying to regain control of the situation. Her training as a model and socialite had taught her to handle public crises, but she had never prepared for this scenario. Carmen pressed play, and the room filled with Victoria's voice, crystal clear and unmistakable. It wasn't the sweet and refined voice she used with Richard, but something rougher, more authentic. The recording revealed everything. Victoria was talking to someone called Victor, describing how that evening she would finally manage to obtain $400 million. She told of 3 years of acting, of how she had studied Richard for months before approaching him, of how she had learned his tastes, his passions, his weaknesses. She described in detail how she psychologically manipulated him, convincing him that every important decision was his initiative. Richard listened paralyzed, his face becoming more livid with each word. The woman he thought he had married for love was revealing herself to be the most skilled con artist he had ever encountered. The voice in the recording revealed that Victoria was already married to Victor, a Moldovan who managed international marriage scams. Their religious wedding in the Hamptons had been completely fake, celebrated by an actor paid to pretend to be a minister. The recording continued with even more shocking details. Victoria had falsified her resume, invented her Harvard MBA, paid actors to pretend to be her relatives during the wedding. Even her charitable activities were a facade. The money raised went directly into her pockets. When the recording ended, silence returned to dominate the study. Richard slowly put down the pen, as if it had suddenly become extremely heavy. His eyes, usually confident and determined, betrayed a vulnerability that Carmen had never seen. Victoria desperately tried to save the situation. She denied everything, accused Carmen of manipulating the recording, claimed it was all a misunderstanding. But her words sounded empty, even to herself. The truth was so evident that every attempt at denial only made her more guilty. Richard slowly rose from his armchair, walked to the window, and stood looking at the rain for what seemed like hours. When he turned, his face showed a disturbing calm, the calm of a man who had just hit bottom and was already planning his comeback. Victoria, realizing that the game was lost, finally abandoned the act. Her face transformed, losing its artificial sweetness to reveal something hard, calculating, deeply cynical. It was as if she had removed a mask she had worn for 3 years. Richard listened to everything without saying a word. When Victoria had finished her confession, he approached the contract still open on the table, methodically tore it into small pieces, and threw them into the lit fireplace. The following days transformed into an investigation that revealed the shocking scope of the scam orchestrated by Victoria. Richard, having overcome the initial shock, set his network of contacts in motion to discover who the woman he had married really was. The results were even more shocking than he had imagined. Victoria Antonescu, this was her real name, was an international criminal specializing in high-level marriage scams. Born in Moldova to a desperately poor family, she had learned from childhood that beauty could be the only escape route from misery. At 16, she had run away from home to reach Viktor Petrov, a 20-year-old con man who had convinced her he was in love with her. In reality, Viktor managed a network of women who married rich men to rob them, and Victoria had become his most promising student. The first marriage scam had occurred in Germany with a 60-year-old industrialist whom Victoria had convinced to put half his factories in her name before disappearing into thin air. Then came a Russian magnate in Moscow, a Norwegian oil executive in Oslo, a Swiss banker in Zurich. Each time the scheme was the same: thorough study of the target, calculated courtship, marriage, asset transfer, disappearance. Richard's private investigator discovered that Victoria had at least 8 different identities, complete with false passports, invented resumes, and carefully constructed personal stories. She was fluent in 6 languages and had studied psychology to better manipulate her victims. But Richard represented the score of a lifetime. $800 million was a sum that would have allowed Victoria and Victor to retire forever from scams and live like royalty in some tax haven. For this, they had planned the operation with maniacal care for 3 years. The investigation also revealed how Victoria had managed to build her false identity so perfectly. She had paid hackers to insert her false credentials into university databases, had bribed officials to obtain false documents, had hired professional actors to pretend to be her relatives during the wedding. Even her supposed charitable activities were a masterpiece of deception. The foundations she presided over existed for real and raised real funds, but the money ended up in offshore accounts controlled by Victor. The sick children Victoria claimed to help were paid actors to perform in promotional photos and videos. The most disturbing thing was the psychological precision with which Victoria had studied him. She had discovered every childhood trauma, every hidden insecurity, every unconfessed desire, and had molded her personality to be exactly what Richard unconsciously sought in a woman. During police interrogations, Victoria maintained her cynical and brazen attitude. She denied nothing, indeed seemed almost amused by the discovery. When asked if she felt any remorse for destroying so many people's lives, she replied that rich men deserved to be robbed. Victor was arrested a few days later in a luxury hotel in Monte Carlo.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Where he was waiting for Victoria with airline tickets to an exotic destination. He turned out to be an even more expert criminal than Victoria, with dozens of marriage scams throughout Europe behind him. During searches, police discovered a detailed archive of all their victims: photos, psychological dossiers, approach strategies, scam timelines. Richard was just the latest in a long list of men who had believed they had found love and instead had met their nightmare. Carmen, the housekeeper who had saved everything, was questioned as a key witness. Her version of events was decisive in reconstructing the entire scam. Her smartphone with the recording became the main evidence that nailed Victoria and Victor to their responsibilities. In the months following the trial, Richard found himself reflecting deeply not only on the scam he had suffered, but on how it had been possible that Carmen, a simple housekeeper, had seen what he had refused to see. The answer came gradually, through increasingly frequent conversations with the woman who had saved his financial and emotional life. Carmen had a past that Richard had never investigated in 10 years of service. She had arrived in America from El Salvador with her 15-year-old daughter, fleeing a violent husband who had made her life hell. She had accepted the job as a housekeeper not by choice, but out of absolute necessity, sacrificing her dignity to guarantee a future for her daughter. Before emigrating, Carmen had been a literature teacher at a high school in San Salvador. She spoke 4 languages, had a degree in education, and a culture that many of Richard's wealthy clients could only dream of. But in America, she was just the Latina MAID, invisible and ignored by everyone. This very invisibility had allowed her to observe Victoria with clear and unscrupulous eyes. Carmen knew manipulation techniques because she had seen them at work in her family, had recognized the signs because she had learned to decode psychological violence. Richard began to realize how many things he had never known about the woman who had cleaned his house for a decade. Carmen had a daughter, Anna, who was now 25 and worked as a software engineer at a tech company. Anna had graduated summa cum laude, while her mother cleaned houses to pay for her studies. Carmen's story was that of thousands of immigrant women who sacrificed everything for their children. She had worked 16 hours a day for years, sending every saved penny for Anna's education. She had never allowed herself a vacation, a new dress, a free evening. During the trial of Victoria and Victor, Carmen was called to testify. Her detailed and precise account impressed judges and lawyers. She spoke with a dignity and lucidity that contrasted dramatically with the cynical arrogance of the defendants. Victoria tried to discredit Carmen's testimony, calling her just an envious maid, but her words sounded pathetic in the face of Carmen's composure and credibility. The trial revealed that Victoria and Victor had robbed at least 12 men throughout Europe for a total of over $200 million. Richard had been the richest target, but not the only one. All the others had fallen into the trap, losing fortunes and dignity. The sentence was exemplary. Victoria was sentenced to 12 years in prison for aggravated fraud, document falsification, and criminal association. Victor got 15 years for the same crimes aggravated by repetition. But, for Richard, the real victory was not criminal justice. It was the discovery that there were still people like Carmen in the world, willing to risk everything to do the right thing. It was the understanding that true wealth is not measured in money, but in moral integrity. After the trial, Richard made a decision that shocked his entourage. He offered Carmen a completely different role in his life. No longer housekeeper, but director of his charitable activities. He wanted her to manage donations, choose causes to support, distinguish between those who really needed help and those who just sought to take advantage. Carmen accepted, on condition that she could continue to live simply. She didn't want luxuries, didn't want to appear. She just wanted the possibility to help people who were in the situation she had been in years before. Desperate, alone, but worthy of a second chance. The year following the trial was one of profound transformation for both. Richard discovered a passion he didn't know he had, that of concretely helping those in difficulty. Under Carmen's guidance, his donations became more targeted, more effective, more human. Carmen transformed Richard's charitable activities from facade operations to concrete projects that really changed people's lives. She created scholarships for children of immigrants, funded professional training courses for women victims of violence, opened reception centers for families in difficulty. Carmen's daughter, Anna, became an IT consultant for Richard's companies, digitalizing processes and increasing efficiency. She was a brilliant girl who had inherited her mother's intelligence and determination, but had had the opportunities that Carmen never had. Richard began to frequent environments completely different from the elite circles he had lived in for years. He visited reception centers, spoke with beneficiaries of his programs, listened to stories of resilience and courage that enriched him more than any financial investment. The Manhattan penthouse transformed. Elite events were replaced by work meetings for social projects. The house that had been the scene of the most elaborate scam became headquarters for initiatives that changed thousands of people's lives. Carmen proved to be an extraordinary organizer. Her life experience allowed her to immediately understand who really needed help and who tried to take advantage of others' generosity. She had developed an infallible instinct for distinguishing authentic desperation from interested acting. One of the most ambitious projects was creating a professional training school for immigrant women. Carmen wanted other women in her situation not to be forced to choose between dignity and survival. The school offered English language courses, professional training, and psychological support to overcome past traumas. Richard discovered that investing in people was much more gratifying than investing in real estate properties. Seeing a woman who escaped domestic violence and found dignified work, seeing an immigrant boy who graduated thanks to a scholarship, seeing families who rebuilt their lives starting from zero. All this had a value that no bank account could measure. Carmen always maintained her simplicity. Despite managing million-dollar budgets and coordinating international projects, she continued to live in the modest apartment she had rented years before. She continued to buy clothes at markets, cook simple dishes, find joy in small things. Richard's transformation didn't go unnoticed in the New York environment. Many of his former elite friends considered him changed for the worse, less interesting, too socially engaged. But Richard had stopped worrying about others' opinions. He had learned that the superficiality of certain environments was fertile ground for predators like Victoria. The De Sanctis Rodriguez Foundation, this was the name Richard wanted to give their organization, became a model studied throughout America. The direct approach, scrupulous verification of needs, personalized accompaniment of beneficiaries, all this created a new standard in the nonprofit world. 5 years after that November evening that had changed everything, Richard found himself again in his Manhattan study. But the room was transformed. Instead of financial contracts, the walls were covered with photos of foundation projects, smiling faces of women who had rebuilt their lives, children studying thanks to scholarships, families who had found dignified housing. Carmen was seated at the desk that had once been Richard's alone, coordinating by phone the opening of a new center in Los Angeles. Her hair was still gray, pulled back in the same severe chignon, but her face had an expression of serenity she had never had in the 10 years she worked as a housekeeper. Daughter Anna had become technology director of all Richard's companies, revolutionizing production processes and increasing profits that were then reinvested in social projects. She was married to an American engineer and expecting her first child, whom Richard already considered like a grandchild. Victoria was still in prison, but Richard had stopped thinking about her with anger. That scam, however painful, had opened his eyes to who he really was and what he wanted from life. In a certain sense, Victoria had given him the greatest gift: freedom from illusions. Carmen had created a network of social sentinels, people who, like her, had lived difficult situations and now helped others recognize scams, violence, exploitation. It was a grassroots protection system that worked better than any institutional control. Richard had discovered wealth that couldn't be quantified in money, the genuine respect of people he helped, the gratitude of those who had received a second chance, the satisfaction of falling asleep each evening, knowing he had done something useful. The Manhattan penthouse had become a pilgrimage site for entrepreneurs from across America who wanted to learn the Morrison Rodriguez model. Richard and Carmen received delegations, held conferences, shared their experience with those who wanted to transform business into an instrument of social change. The most emotional moment came when Anna gave birth to her first child. Richard and Carmen found themselves together in the hospital. He who had become an adoptive grandfather, she who had become a grandmother for the first time. Looking at that baby, they understood they were leaving a better world for future generations. The story of Richard and Carmen proved that sometimes life's greatest lessons come from the people you least expect. That true nobility has nothing to do with money or lineage, but with the courage to do the right thing even when it costs sacrifices. Richard never remarried. He had found in collaboration with Carmen and foundation projects a completeness he had never experienced even in marriage. He had learned that love isn't just romantic, but also what one nurtures for all humanity. Carmen never returned to El Salvador. America had become her true homeland, the place where she had found not only survival, but fulfillment. She had proven that immigrants aren't a burden on society, but a resource if valued for what they really are. On the evening of the 5th anniversary of that fateful November night, Richard and Carmen found themselves again in the study, where everything had begun. They looked together at photos on the walls, read some thank you letters from project beneficiaries, planned future initiatives. Richard pulled out the same gold pen with which he had been about to sign the contract that would have ruined him. That evening he used it to sign a very different document. The will that left all his wealth to the Morrison Rodriguez Foundation, guaranteeing their work would continue even after his death. Victoria's scam was over. But the love for humanity that had been born from that November night would last forever, multiplying in every life it touched, in every person it helped, in every dream it made possible. Because this was the story's true lesson, that the greatest wealth isn't what you accumulate, but what you share. And that sometimes it takes a courageous housekeeper to teach a billionaire what it truly means to be rich. Like if you believe true courage comes from the simplest people. Comment telling about when someone saved you from a dangerous situation. Share to honor all the Carmens of the world who risk everything for truth. Subscribe for more stories proving heroism has no social class. Sometimes who saves you is who no one sees. Sometimes the greatest wisdom lives in the humblest homes. And sometimes it takes a housekeeper to teach a millionaire what wealth really is.